Well, hello and welcome again, my friend, to another Living Point broadcast or podcast where we navigate life from God's viewpoint. We give you tips and principles and sometimes ideas, practical ideas to help you navigate your everyday lives from God's viewpoint. Today we continue with our series on boundaries. In fact, we call this series Taking Control of Your Life. And it is based on a book I am reading called Boundaries, a book written by Dr. H. Cloud and John Townsend. So the book looks like this. This is actually the book. And I would recommend that you get this book if you feel like your life is out of control and you need to figure out from a biblical perspective how to reorder and get your life under control. That's exactly what I personally am trying to do, and I know it will help you. It's helping me greatly. Now, I want to say that I'm sharing on this subject, taking control of your life, from this book. And so therefore, most of the thoughts and ideas are going to be coming from the book, my reflections and content in the book, as well as biblical principles that the authors have suggested to back up or to support their particular point. So today we're going to talk about, last time we were here, we talked about boundaries and what does that look like, a boundaryless life. In fact, we begin by talking about how we take control of our lives. And there are basically three principles that were discussed last time. And one of them is, first of all, discerning your purpose. What is your why? When you understand your why, it sets you on a path, on the right trajectory, on the right course to begin to understand the perimeters with which you establish your boundaries. The second thing we talked about was demonstrating wisdom, because in examining and setting boundaries and establishing boundaries, you will need godly wisdom. You will need the right sense of right and wrong and knowledge and how to execute it to establish effective boundaries. So we talk about, secondly, demonstrating proper wisdom. The third thing we looked at was developing boundaries. So we talk about how God himself established boundaries for us, and he wants us to do the same for our lives. And so it is that this afternoon, my friends, that we're going to kind of delve into. And so our subject for this episode is, what does boundary look like? What does a boundary look like? This is very important for us to get, because there are times when we will have demands placed on us by our parents, by our children, by our bosses, maybe by our church leaders or friends. And sometimes we have established certain way of operating that sort of indicates that we do not understand what boundaries are. So today we want to talk about that in a very simple way. We want to share with you some principles and ideas about what a boundary look like. But let's first begin to look at the physical world. The physical world, like we all know, have boundaries to keep undesirable stuff out of it, out of your yard, for example, and to safeguard valuable stuff that you have. Boundaries have different appearance and will perhaps apply differently to different people in different circumstances. But some may be fences in the physical world, your yard. You have fences or maybe edging. Perhaps it's a wall that you have there. They represent your physical boundaries. They give the same message to anyone and everyone that's encounter them, that this is where my property begins, and I'm the owner of this property, and I'm legally responsible for what happens on this property, and no non-owner are responsible. I am the one responsible. It's the same concept with boundaries. You cannot blame somebody for doing something, or for demanding of you something, or expecting of you something, if you have not first established what those boundaries are for persons. They are not the ones that are responsible to establish boundaries in your personal life. For the property, physical boundaries mark a visible property line that someone else holds the deed or the title for. So it is with your life. We have physical lines or markers we should establish in our lives that indicates that this is my responsibility, and this is your responsibility and my expectations of you, and therefore I will not allow anyone to violate this, or this is how I expect you to operate with my boundaries. So you can go to the city hall and find out exactly where someone else's boundaries at, if there's no particular markers, or what their responsibilities are, and whom to call if they have any kind of business matter to deal with a certain property. It should be the same way in your life. People should know what are the steps, what are the things that you allow, and how they get to understand what your responsibilities are and theirs. Now, that's the physical world. In the spiritual world, boundaries are just as real, but often harder to see. And the boundaries we're talking about today really are rooted in a spiritual foundation, because the Bible and God Himself established boundaries for us and have boundaries for Himself as well. And therefore, when we think about boundaries, don't just think about them as emotional decisions you make. Don't just think about them as being socially responsible, even though that is a part of the nature of boundaries. But in a deeper sense, boundaries have a spiritual nature. And that is what it is important for us to understand. And I give you an example of what this boundary might look like and how crucial this boundary is. It is as much like the atmospheric boundaries that surrounds our planet and other planets as well. But in particular, our planet, because we live here, we know what it is, we know about this one, right? Without the Earth, without the atmospheric boundaries, Earth would be inhabitable. We would all perhaps die instantly if they were supposed to be moved suddenly. That is how vital spiritual boundaries are. They are the essence of what sustain life. The goal of this chapter, and I'm in chapter 2 of this book because I'm taking my time with it. The goal of this chapter in the book is to help us define what is tangible, what is our tangible boundaries, and to recognize them as an ever-present reality that, catch this, can increase your love and save your life. Wow, that is powerful. Think about it. Boundaries are an ever-present reality that can increase our love and save our lives. The earth has at least 5 major and several secondary layers, from lowest to highest. And we must have our boundaries set up, that we have those sort of framework in place. When we don't have boundaries, my friend, our lives become very miserable. And sometimes it will not be verbalized, but it will be internalized. And it is important that we not just internalize some of these turmoil that we are facing, but that we reflect on them and establish boundaries to protect them. So what is the first thing that I will recommend that you do in order to understand what does a boundary look like? First explanation. One, let's talk about boundary clarification. You need to clarify boundaries, your boundaries. So before you can tell others what your boundaries are, you need to be clear in your mind and in yourself and your heart what it is that your boundaries look like. How do they look, and how should person interact with them? You need some fence to keep some problems out of your life, and where necessary to protect that which is valuable in your life. It is not being mean. It is not being inconsiderate. It is not being selfish. In fact, it is being very proactive and caring, because you want to be able to be so whole in yourself and comfortable in yourself that you are able to respond to the needs of others without compromising yourself, compromising your feeling, compromising your purpose, right? So let's look at it. We must clarify where our boundary begins and where they end. Boundaries defines us. They define what is for me and what is not for me. Boundaries show me where I end and where someone else begins. Boundaries tell me what I am responsible for and what I am not responsible for. In other words, when you have established boundaries in your life, it gives you freedom to own your responsibility and the freedom to not feel bad about somebody else's responsibility. But that is only if you know where your boundaries are. Because if you don't know where your fence is, then maybe when you're cutting your lawn, when you're mowing your lawn, you will end up cutting everybody else's, even though that was not your intention. And by the way, nothing is wrong if you decide to help your neighbor out, but that is not your responsibility. But if you don't have any fencing or borderline, then you will not know where your yard ends and where your yard begins. So taking responsibility is the second thing. So you clarify your boundary, and then you take responsibility for your own actions, your own choices, your own decisions. It helps you to understand where your limits are and where others begin. Think of how confusing it would be if someone told you to guard their property diligently because they will hold you responsible for what happened there, and then did not tell you where the boundaries of that property is. And they didn't even give you any means either to defend or to protect that property. How frustrating that would be. It would be confusing, but potentially also it would be dangerous. And that is exactly what happens to us emotionally and spiritually, the author outlined, so that we understand that boundary clarification is very essential, and taking responsibility for establishing boundary is also a priority in our lives. Listen, God designed a world where we all live within ourselves. That is, we exhibit our own soul, and we are responsible for the things that make us who we are. The Bible said each heart knows its own bitterness and no one else can share its joys. Proverbs 14 and verse 10. In other words, you know the things that you are dealing with. You know internally and within your own parameters what are the stuff that you have to deal with. And you alone can enjoy in a real way the joys that you experience. So you are responsible for your soul, not somebody else. You cannot blame another person. So you must deal with it. Deal with your own soul. You must set your own boundaries to define what is for you and where your parameters are and what is right and wrong in your own life, where you are responsible to ensure your own protection. The Bible tells us clearly that our parameters are where our parameters are and how to protect them. But often we allow family, other past relationship, even present relationships to confuse us about where these limits are. In addition to that, the author said he shows us what we are responsible. God shows us what we are responsible for and help us to define what our boundaries are. God, through the word of God, through the Bible, established for us what the properties that we have, the responsibility that we have, and we can look at an example. For example, responsible for other people. We are not responsible for other people, but we are responsible to other people. Did you get that? We are responsible. We are not responsible for other people, but we are responsible to other people. Galatians 6 and verse 2 help us to understand this in a very powerful way. The Bible tells us when we do care for each other, bear each other's burden, right, we fulfill the law of Christ. What this verse shows us is our responsibility to one another, but not our responsible for. Did you get that? In other words, the Bible helps us to understand that there are people sometimes in our lives who have burdens and responsibilities that are bigger than them, too heavy for them to bear, and in that case, they need help. Maybe they do not have enough strength or resource or the knowledge to carry the load that they need to carry. So therefore, they need help. And to deny ourselves to help others is one of the things that the Bible does not support. What they cannot do for themselves, in other words, God, through His Word, says, we show sacrificial love by helping to carry their load. This is what Christ did for us, because we could not save ourselves, we could not redeem ourselves, and therefore Christ redeemed us by sacrificing His life. Now, this is where we are talking about where we are responsible to, but not for. No, Christ is responsible to us by making it possible for us to be saved. But He's not going to come down to earth and make choices that will cause us to be saved or to receive salvation. He will not come down and make choices for us that will allow our lives to be lived healthy and godly. We have to do that every day. So Christ did what we couldn't do, but we have a responsibility to do what we have to do, what we should do. So it's the same thing with our lives. You will help people to the point where they aren't able to help themselves. But where they are able to do something for themselves and carry their responsibility, you should not feel obligated to have to do that for them. So Galatians 6, on the other hand, tell us about this principle. Verse 5 says that each one should carry their own load. Everyone has responsibility that only he or she can carry these things. we have a responsibility to carry our own particular load, and we don't necessarily need anybody to help us. Daily responsibility for our own work and our own lives and our own actions and our own choices are in our own hands. No one can do certain things for us. We have to take ownership for certain aspect of our lives. That's our own load. Galatians 6 and verse 5. So we see the two sides of the coin, where before Galatians tell us, Galatians 6 verse 2 tells us that we must bear each other burden. So it identify that there are cases where persons will not be able to help themselves and they may need your help. That's how you show love. But then at the other hand, you might have people in your life, they can get up and go and work and make their money. You don't need to send them money every month for them to survive, when you can help them to buy some kind of resource that they can turn over and make money for themselves. Or they can get up, write a resume, write an application, show up for an interview and get a job. Are you with me? So you must establish that boundary, that your duty is not to work and necessarily support somebody that is healthy body and, able, intelligent enough to able to have a job where they can make money and take care of themselves. But if you have somebody that may be disabled or whatever, and you have to support them or whatever, that's a different scenario. So you must have boundary in your life. Everyone has responsibility that only he or she can carry out, and you must ensure that we carry out and do our own responsibility. Are you with me so far? So we talk about boundary clarification, we talk about personal responsibility, and we want to look at this verse a little bit closer, because the verse tells us no one can do certain things for us. So the Greek word for burden and load, it's different, right? So gives us insight into the meaning. It gives us insight into the meaning of what Paul is talking about. The Greek word for burden means excess burden, or burden that are so heavy that they weigh us down. In other words, it's like a boulder or this big plank that you need to move to somewhere or to build something, and you alone cannot move it. And so you need help. In contrast, the Greek word for load means cargo, or the burden of daily toil. This word describes everyday things. And you can use perhaps a knapsack as an example. You have your knapsack with your books and your pencil and your whatever. You can carry that. You don't necessarily need somebody to carry that for you. We are expected to carry our own load. We are expected to deal with our own feelings and attitudes and behaviors and responsibility. God has even given to each one of us these autonomy. God has given to us autonomy and will, that we can make choices even in our problem moments, even our circumstances. God gives us the ability to make choices. So you can't blame somebody else if you did not establish boundary and they violate your circumstance, your life. Right? Let's look closer at boundary as we come to the close of this podcast. The nature of boundaries. We need to keep things that will nurture us inside our fences, still using the same metaphor that the author used, keeping things that will harm us outside of our fences. In short, write this down. Boundaries helps keep the good in and the bad out of your life. That's essentially what boundaries are. The nature of boundaries, they help you keep good things in and bad things out. So anything that you have in your life, any permission that you give to somebody, any choice that you're making, any attitude that you have that is letting in good and keeping out bad, then that's a healthy boundary. In fact, the Bible tells us in Matthew 46, verse 19, that we must establish boundaries to protect our treasures. Let me make sure I'm giving you the right information in terms of the text here. Matthew, not 46, sorry, I made a mistake. 26, right? Tells us that we must guard our treasures so that people will not steal them. They keep the pearls in and the pigs out. Sometimes we have bad on the inside and good on the outside. And sometimes it's not really something that we intentionally do or we intentionally allow in our lives. The point is sometimes, even from childhood, we have circumstances that caused us to experience negative emotions. For example, somebody might experience abuse in their life. Somebody might experience, trauma that cause you to shut in the bad and, keep out the good. Somebody wants to love us. Somebody wants to care for us. But because we have this traumatic experience, we what? We lock ourselves away from loving, and we keep the bad emotions, the bad feelings. We don't learn to deal with them and get them dealt with and sought out. The Bible does not say that we are to be walled off from others. In fact, it's the reverse. John 17 verse 11. We are to be in community with each other. But in every community, all members have their own space, and the things that the property lines and the perimeters that are enough to allow people to pass through, but they are strong enough to keep danger out. Oftentimes, people who abuse our relationship. So the Bible wants us to understand that not that we should be closed off. Our boundaries are not designed to keep everybody out. Our boundaries are designed to what? Let through the things that are aligned with our purpose, the things that are wise, and the things that does not violate our boundary. God defines himself as distinct and a separate being that is responsible for himself. So even God himself established boundaries. The concept of boundary comes from the very nature of God. We know God is holy, God is distinct, and God is unique from everything else and everyone else. He also defines himself as separate from his creation. From us, he differentiates himself from others, which tells us God is serious about boundaries. For God also limits what he will allow in his yard. He confronts sins and he allows consequences for behaviors, attitude, or actions that violate his boundaries. He guards his own house and will not allow evil things to go in there. That is why we know that no sin can enter into heaven, because God has set his boundaries as to what he will allow in and what he will prevent from coming in. So even God has boundaries. He gave us personal responsibility with limits because he expects us to establish our own boundaries as well. We need to develop boundaries like God. Example, boundaries are anything that helps to differentiate you from someone else or show where your responsibility begins and where it ends. I want you to get that today. It protects your peace, it protects your health, it protects your emotion, it protects your attitude, it protects your character. That's what boundaries are for. Anything that helps to differentiate you from others and your responsibility from others' responsibility. Even our bodies have boundaries. God gave us a skin that protects germs and stuff from entering. It allows us to be able to breathe and to, protect our organs. So these are things that God has established for us to be able to have healthy, happy, joyful life. So the author said one of the most basic boundary setting word is no. Do you know how to say no? Do you know when to say no? Do you know why you have to say no? There are circumstances, and some of us, like myself, we tend to be very accommodative, and even sometimes when it is inconvenient for us, we tend to say yes. But one of the basic concept of boundary, or words that establish boundaries, is no. No. And we must be able to say, in fact, it's a full statement and sentence, the author said, that no is a complete sentence. No. The Bible said that we are to confront people we love, saying no sometimes. I will not participate in this. I will not do this because it violates and it abuses my why. Many passages in the scriptures urges us to say no to stuff that are not good for us. In fact, in Timothy, Paul said, Timothy, flee youthful lusts, flee unrighteousness, and pursue righteousness and godliness and holiness. So the Bible helps us to understand no is important sometimes. So today, I hope that you would have learned something and you have benefited from today's session where we talk about what healthy boundaries look like. First, healthy boundaries are boundaries that are properly clarified. Healthy boundaries are boundaries that we establish our responsibilities and that of others. And remember, healthy boundaries deals with being responsible to people or others, but not for others. That's how God designed it, and that's how we must embrace it and live with it. May you have a wonderful day today. Remember that a boundaryless life is hindrance to the abundant life. A boundaryless life is hindrance to the abundant life. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Living Point podcast, where we seek to navigate life from God's viewpoint. I hope this podcast today would have helped you further on in your journey to take control of your life. See you next time as we look forward to sharing with you on this important topic of taking control of your life. God bless you. Have a great afternoon. I pray your Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit of God, will keep you. May His face shine on you and be gracious unto you and give you His peace now and forever. Amen. Have a great one. Take care.